Seja toda a gente bem-vinda ao Apenas Fumaça, um programa fumaça onde se fala sobre a sociedade com quem quer falar sobre ela. Eu sou a Margarida David Cardoso. Ano após ano, as emissões globais de gases com efeito de estufa batem recordes. A concentração de dióxido de carbono na atmosfera nunca foi tão elevada. A última medição supera qualquer outro valor em 400 mil anos. Neste cenário à escala global, a Europa tem planos para inverter este caminho. Ainda assim, as emissões per capita dos 28 são superiores à média mundial. O que está a Europa a fazer é suficiente? O que condiciona as decisões políticas sobre um assunto que muitos cientistas e ativistas deixaram, há muito, de considerar técnico e veem como uma matéria política. Está a Europa a preparar-se para uma transição justa, tendo em conta a forma como os seus cidadãos trabalham, produzem e consomem? Pode o crescimento da extrema-direita nas instituições europeias travar necessários esforços para cortar nas emissões? Falamos com o holandês Bas Eickhout, eurodeputado do Grupo dos Verdes, Aliança Livre Europeia, desde 2009 e um dos dois candidatos do Partido Verde Europeu ao cargo de Presidente da Comissão Europeia. Bas é membro da Comissão de Ambiente, Saúde Pública e Segurança Alimentar e da Delegação para as Relações com os Estados Unidos da América. Antes da carreira política, estudou Química e Ciências do Ambiente, tendo sido investigador na Agência Holandesa de Avaliação Ambiental. Esta entrevista foi gravada em Estrasburgo, para onde o Fumaça viajou a convite do Parlamento Europeu em março. Conversamos em inglês, mas a tradução para português está disponível no nosso site em www.fumaca.pt. Queria ainda alertar-vos de que há um erro nesta entrevista. Quando cito dados do relatório do painel intergovernamental para as alterações climáticas sobre a subida da temperatura mundial em 1,5 graus, digo que este órgão avisa de que a tendência de aumento das emissões pode ser revertida no espaço de 1 ou 2 anos. Queria dizer 11 anos. É essa janela de oportunidade que, segundo um relatório divulgado em outubro do ano passado, as sociedades têm para fazer mudanças profundas e rápidas nos transportes, indústria, energia e agricultura. Fiquem com a entrevista. In last October, the IPCC released a report saying coal-fired electricity must end by the year 2050 if you want to limit global warming, preferably until 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And it demonstrates if global temperature increases to 2 degrees Celsius, some impacts may be long-lasting and irreversible. Could you explain this 1.5 degrees limit? What are we talking about in specific?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I think it's always important to stress that in the end it's a political decision on what level you want, right? So internationally, the entire world said, okay, we want to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And then, of course, the question is, when is it dangerous or not? To put it more cynically, what are we willing to accept that is going to happen? And I think the latest science is just showing that that climate change impacts are more severe even by lower increases. And I think that's the reason. For years we talked about 2 degrees, but I think there's now good reason to say, well, it's probably better to stay closer to 1.5 for several reasons. First of all, with 1.5 degrees, the very, very vulnerable ecosystems will already be hit. So think of coral reef that probably will already disappear even with 1.5. So that's something that apparently we are willing to accept. Secondly, we do see, of course, already impacts on glaciers and the North Pole ice melting. So there's already quite some impact there. And more and more the scientific evidence is showing that we might even get, if you would allow it to 2 degrees, so further warming, that you would get to tipping points. Tipping points meaning that the melting of glaciers and ice sheets would get so high that at a certain moment, because of that, that you then get an accelerated effect, and that it will really disappear from the North Pole.
Yeah, and you can't go back.
And you can't go back. And I think if you don't have ice on the North Pole anymore, we're really talking about a different stage in climate change. So I think those are good reasons why now more and more, scientists are warning, and politicians are saying, let's stay below 1.5 degree. Last point, low-lying islands. So we're talking about sea level rise, and I think this is, of course, why internationally this was such a fight. It was the low-lying islands like the Maldives. Were saying, guys, we're talking about our future here, and we might just disappear. So that's another reason why you would stay lower than we previously aimed for.
But talking about people, what would be the most affected people? We are talking about people in developing countries, or
Yeah, I think if you now already look at impacts, so sea level rise will of course impact a lot of people living close to the coast, and unfortunately, a lot of people live close to the coast because that's where we built our cities. Secondly, agriculture. You're already, and this is mainly indeed in Africa. You see already that droughts are heavily impacting agriculture practices. So crop yields are going down, but this is also more and more, of course, a concern for regions in the south of Europe. So think Spain, Portugal. I think you know very well already the droughts in summer, thinking of the forest fires as a consequence. But what is also a big concern is there's quite a lot of people are very dependent of glaciers. Because glaciers, they make sure that in summertime you still have water. So think of regions in the Himalaya. There's quite some people there are very much, their agriculture is dependent of glacier melting in summer. If those glaciers disappear and you are from that moment just dependent of snow and rain when it's raining and snowing, that means that also there in summer it might be impossible to do your agriculture practices. And that of course will impact a lot of people in the Himalaya area. So this is really, climate change is impacting a lot of people already. And well, of course, the richer you are, the better you can protect yourself. But to a certain level, right? I mean, I come from the Netherlands. We always think that we can build high dikes, but there is a maximum how you can build the dikes, and I think that's that not all the people do realize.
Okay, despite decades of looking for agreements to cut the green gas emissions, 2018 was the year global carbon emission jumped to a new record. A research from the Global Carbon Project launched at the UN Climate Change Summit last year in Poland projected that fossil CO2 emissions rose more than 2% in the year 2017 and 2018, heading to an opposite direction of the cuts we are talking about. Are the efforts to decarbonize the economy not yet enough to overcome the growing global energy needs?
No, we're not on track.
Okay.
I mean, this is also what the science is saying. If you are agreeing with the Paris targets, which we just discussed, so 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees, if you want to stay below that, then we need to decarbonize our economy much faster. If you look at Europe, for example, you could say on the positive side, we have policies in place. We have energy laws, climate laws in place until 2030. But also there, if you see on how fast we need to go down with our emissions, also Europe is not doing enough. The high increase that we saw globally is, of course, because of fast-growing economies. Think China and India. But also they are changing, right? And I think it's also now becoming an interesting question for Europe is if you look at the investments in new technologies, then India is going much faster on solar. They are really heavily investing on solar now. And in China, they are heavily investing on electrification of transport. Maybe not always because of climate. They have huge problems with air quality in their cities. So then also it makes sense to clean up your car park in the cities. But if you see how fast China is investing on that, I think for Europe it also becomes a question of do we want to stay in the lead technologically speaking? I mean, the future jobs should be in this green economy. Well, the big challenge is then also for Europe is that not only for climate purposes we should act faster, but also to stay in the lead for new technology development. So there's a lot of reasons why Europe should move faster.
Okay, yeah, 2 weeks ago you said in Parliament that the future of Europe is green jobs, and other regions, and I'm quoting, in the world are moving, are investing. Look at California, but also look at solar investments in India. And for instance, look at the electric transportation in China.
Yeah.
The German car industry is investing more in electric transportation in China than in Germany. What do you mean by that?
So what we know is that that the German car industry was of course a huge lobby against any climate policies on the cars, on the transport sector. And while they are lobbying in Europe in order to prevent tough policies here, so in a way they like to keep on having their diesel engines just being sold on the European market, we know that that same German car industry, who is here blocking policies, is investing in electric cars in China.
Why?
Because the policies are clearer there. And this shows you how important policies are. As sometimes people say, we don't need policies, the market will solve it. Well, this is a clear example. The German car industry knows that if you want to keep on selling cars in China, you will have to move to electric. Because the Chinese policies for all their big cities, for example, in Beijing, they want to be fully electric by 2030. So think of, it's Beijing has the size of a country like Belgium, and they want to be fully electric there because of air quality. So, and you know a bit how China works. If they call a policy, it's going to happen. So that's the clear direction that China is taking. So the German car industry knows that if they want to have a foot on the ground in the Chinese market, they have to invest in electrification of their car industry. So that's what they're doing in China. But at the same time, in Europe, where you would say, well, if you are investing in electric cars, which is cleaner, which is better for a lot of reasons, maybe you should also then in Europe do that. But they're not. So when they are spending money in innovation, they do more on electrification in China than in Europe. In Europe, they're still investing in just selling their diesel engines. And that shows you that the German car industry expects that they need to move to electric in China, but try to sell their diesel engines, which of course for them is easier money making. They try to sell that as long as possible at the European market. So we are stuck with polluting cars while they invest in the cleaner cars in China. This just shows you that if we don't put up our policies, we will miss out. And then in 10 years' time, we will start importing electric cars from China. Well, there goes your jobs, right? So it's the other way around. And this is really showing that Europe needs to be much tougher, certainly on the German car industry.
We are lacking policies?
We are not tough enough. I think the entire Dieselgate scandal, where the Americans found out that the German car industry was cheating on their diesel technology, although we have much more diesel in our market, it just shows that we are too hesitant to be tough on our industry. And of course, the conservative politicians then always say, yeah, but we need to keep our jobs in Europe. It's always the job argument. And this is why I always say, if you really are concerned about future jobs, then if we are now not tough on them and don't force them to change, the rest of the world will change and we will start importing those new technologies. So in order to maintain the jobs and to get new jobs in Europe, we need to be much tougher on them. And I always say it's the conservatives who are weak on the industry who are killing the jobs.
Okay, but in the session 2 weeks ago where you discussed the climate change and also the European Commission's plan to decarbonize until 2050, there were only 28 members of parliament in the room of the 751.
Yeah.
What does that tell you?
It tells you that despite the rhetorics of a lot of politicians, climate change for a lot of politicians is just one of the many issues. Whereas I think climate change is really a substantial and fundamental challenge for how to deal with that as a European society. Plus, it's about our future economy. So I would say this issue should be the number one for a lot of politicians. And here you see, it's not the case. For a lot of politicians, it's just one of the many issues, and they move from topic to topic, and climate change is one of the 20 they are dealing with. And I think that was very visible in that plenary 2 weeks ago, where indeed hardly any politician showed up.
Yeah.
Pretty sad picture. Yeah.
6 years ago, a director at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change said that big companies are paying to discredit climate science. Do you still see that happening? And how can regulators, or in this case the MPs, go against this?
Yeah,
this
I think this is another taboo still in the political arena. Is what do we do with the fossil industry? And you know, it's very simple. If you are serious about decarbonizing our economy. And in a way, it's not even the Greens saying that, but it's the European Commission themselves saying in 2050, we can be decarbonizing we can have decarbonized our economy. Okay, if that's your future vision, then you do know that all your policies will go against the fossil industry, because the fossil industry, by definition, is based on carbon. And they are selling oil, they're selling gas, they're selling coal. So any policy will be against their interest. And I think we should be much tougher on them. And we have a couple of proposals also. For example, in the UN summits where we talk climate, we are proposing that fossil industry should not be welcome anymore. This is what we do with health. All the health ministries in the world have agreed not to allow any tobacco industry lobby anymore.
Do you think we can compare?
I think we can. Also in the strategies where the tobacco industry was discrediting science and saying that it's not proven that you get cancer from smoking. And later on it turned out it is proven. It's just, it's trying to create doubt. That same strategy is absolutely now done by a lot of these fossil companies about climate change. Is the human really having an impact on climate change? And once that was proven, yeah, but it's not so much. Once that was proven, yeah, but the solutions are expensive. All that creating doubt is what they're doing. And I think it's logical because their business is at stake. But I think from a political perspective, we should treat fossil industry the way we are treating tobacco industry.
Okay. But for instance, the IPCC report also says that the trend can still be turned around until if we have a year or 2 years, if profound and quick transition to green economy is done. But we talk about transportation industry and also in energy and farming. What about farming? What are the main aspects that we need to, or the MPs need to account for?
Well, I think on agriculture, that's one of the most painful topics, I would say, at the European level. If you currently see, our agriculture policies are still aimed at the more you produce, the more money you get, the more subsidies you get. So it's very production-based subsidy system. And I think that is really the biggest problem, because then you are more or less forcing the farmer to enlarge because the more you produce, the more money you get. So it's stimulating this large-scale farming. Whereas we all know that for climate purposes, if you want to prepare your agriculture for the future where climate will be more extreme, so agriculture needs to be capable of dealing with those extremes. You have more periods with a lot of water, and then you have periods with not so much water. Of course, a very large-scale monoculture is very difficult to adapt to these circumstances. So in our subsidy system, we should much more focus our subsidies on how we produce our agriculture. I mean, there are all kind of new ways of dealing with agriculture. For example, agroforestry, where you combine agriculture and forestry, which of course would make your entire area much more resilient against flooding, against droughts, because trees help you in maintaining the water in the soil. So you should promote and subsidize much more these kind of complex quality systems of agriculture instead of what we're still supporting, and that's just monocultures, big support. On the more support you get. Our common agriculture policies are so stupid.
Okay, but they should be a new cap. They should new.
Yeah. That absolutely. We are discussing now at the European level our reform of agriculture policy. So this should be the moment. If we're talking about climate change, maybe we should now also start talking about climate change in our agriculture policies, which we are more and more. The center parties are acknowledging that we need to do something, but it's little steps. It's going way too slow.
Yeah, but these questions are not new. We talk about CAP for a long time. But
that's why I said this is the more painful topics for the European Union, because until now we have not managed to really substantially reform our agriculture policies. Unfortunately, we don't have the majority. That's the problem.
And do you think, or for instance, can states, or they should be sanctioned or bring it to justice? I don't know. If they go against climate directives, for instance, if a country starts exploring a campaign on oil and gas, do you think today it makes sense?
I think
a country in Europe, of course.
Yeah. For many reasons, it doesn't make sense because it's for climate purposes. We really have to think of now leaving the fossils into the ground instead of getting them out. The alternatives are also available. That's what IPCC always says. Is if you look at the alternatives, they are there. But what the problem is there is no political will to make sure that you avoid these kind of things from happening. That new companies will go to new gas fields or whatsoever. What the problem a bit at this moment is that our rules are limited in Europe. There's still, of course, also national sovereignty. So countries can decide, unfortunately, if they want to, they theoretically can decide to go for new gas fields. Of course, what we try to put in place is carbon pricing that you can do at the European level. So at least makes high carbon intensive fuels more expensive. But to be very honest, that price is still too low. So we are now talking about 20 to 25 euros per ton CO2, whereas for Paris implementation, you have to think of 50, 60. So the price is too small. What you now have still as an option, and that you see, of course, more and more, is that some citizens are going to the court. Legal challenges. And that is now an interesting new field. We had a court case in the Netherlands against the government, which was saying like, okay, if you are subscribing to the UN treaties and you are saying that climate change is a severe threat for humanity, at the same time, there are, of course, rules for the government that they should protect their citizens. So if you add those two, then governments are not protecting their citizens enough. And on that basis, now people are going to courts. In the Netherlands, 2 times we won. And there's now also a European case where some European citizens are taking the EU to the court. I think that's an interesting development because I'm of course at the political arena, so I'm partly trying to make sure that majorities are putting the right policies in place. Unfortunately, I do see that the current majorities are not there to really push for ambitious policies, so that then people are through the court, through the legal way, are trying to influence climate change policies. That's an interesting development, of course, and I would say it's helping us because then it's waking up other people again to say, okay, maybe we should be tougher on our policies.
Okay. But for instance, do you believe it's necessary to have European law on environment or something that goes above the government and the states?
Well, I think, to be very honest, I do think that our current framework on how we deal with energy policies is not working. So, but this is a difficult discussion, right? Because you always have a debate in Europe like, this is national sovereignty. We can decide this on our own and we're very proud of that and Europe should not be a super state. But if you think of our future energy system, it matters a lot what kind of direction countries are going. And to be very frank, the energy infrastructure is already European. So this kind of idea that you have national sovereignty is nonsense. It doesn't really exist in real life. However, that the markets, the investors, they look at Europe. They don't look at Portugal or France or Germany anymore. Those countries are too small for the big investors. So they do want to know which direction is Europe going. And if on the one hand, you have Poland going for coal. Next to it is Germany going to renewables. Next to it, you have France going to nuclear. All those decisions have huge different implications for the infrastructure. So an investor who has the money, the problem in Europe is not that we don't have enough money. There is enough money. The problem is that investors don't invest it. And why? They don't know where Europe is going. Because nuclear requires a totally other infrastructure than renewables or coal. So as long as we don't have a clear idea where Europe is going, we will have lack of investment in infrastructure, and a lack of investment in infrastructure will prevent us from decarbonizing our energy system, because, of course, if you want to decarbonize your energy system, we need to start connecting all the different resources we are having. And just a simple example, the connection between Portugal, Spain on the one hand and France is very weak. There's hardly any connection between France and the Iberian island. Whereas there's a huge potential for solar in the Iberian island, but you can't export it to the rest of Europe. This is such a waste of resources, but unfortunately we can't force, at the European level, a country to invest in those infrastructures. And I think that really needs to change. I really think that Europe should have a bigger say on the energy system, and then we can more develop infrastructure, and we can indeed also say, guys, we have to stop with our fossils. But for the time being, we don't have the powers.
Okay. But do you think why do you think this year's European election are about climate?
I think it's finally becoming clear to a lot of people how substantial the climate crisis is. How you see protests on the street now every week. And it's very good that it's the young people now going on the streets saying, guys, this is about our future. So I think climate change is now really a topic. And clearly, if you want to do something about climate change, you have to look at the European level. I mean, I personally was a climate change researcher back 10 years ago, and I decided to be active at the European political level because that's the level where you can do climate change policies. So combining those two, knowing how important Europe is for climate policies, and finally the topic in itself is now high on the agenda, I think that combined makes it very likely that these May elections will be climate elections.
Okay. Do you think that the rising of populist movements and far-right parties will delay the efforts or can compromise the efforts on the Paris Agreement?
It has a danger, of course. I mean, the populist parties, by the way, I never fully understand that. Somehow, if you are Eurosceptic and nationalistic, you are also a climate skeptic.
Would you say there's a connection?
There is a connection, but it's not necessarily has to be there, right? Because a lot of these populist parties are very afraid of Muslim countries. Well, if you look at our energy dependence, we are totally dependent of the Middle East. So I would say, from a populistic perspective, there are good reasons to be less reliant on the Middle East, right? So I would expect that some of those populist parties would go for very tough renewable policies, because there you can own your own energy, you can make your own energy, and you're not dependent of the Middle East anymore. I would say a populist politician, it's a no-go, and it's a no-brainer, isn't it? But somehow still they are against climate change policies, so they prefer to stay reliable. They remain dependent of Saudi Arabia. Apparently, they prefer that. Okay, that's fine. So yes, there is a danger that populist parties will delay climate change action. But I think that's why it's another reason why these will be climate elections, because I think everywhere in Europe you see that people are not happy with the political status quo. And I think we as Greens are neither happy with the current status quo. So then you can choose, or you go for a populist vote, but they most of the time know that they hate Europe, but don't come up with other solutions. Or I would say you can go more to the green side of the political spectrum, and we are very much for European cooperation, but on a much different path, which is really going for a social and green policy. I think that's a bit the options you have if you are so dissatisfied with the current political system. Then there are alternatives, and I hope that people do realize that going for the populist, they sound as if they have easy answers, but look at Brexit. In reality, those easy answers don't exist. The world is more complex than that, and I think then I hope that people will see that maybe another alternative's there, and that is for European cooperation, but another Europe.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Este foi mais um episódio do Apenas Fumaça, um programa Fumaça onde se fala sobre a sociedade com quem quer falar sobre ela. Obrigada a Bas Eickhout, eurodeputado e candidato pelo Partido Verde Europeu. Esta entrevista foi preparada por mim, Margarida David Cardoso. O Bernardo Afonso fez a edição de som. Fazem ainda parte da equipa Fumaça Ana Freitas, Frederico Raposo, Maria Almeida, Mo Tafes, Pedro Miguel Santos, Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro, Sofia Rocha, Tomás Pereira e Tomás Pinho. A música é dos Lutos Fever. Houve mais episódios em fumaca.pt, no YouTube, Spotify e na tua aplicação de podcasts. Até já!